Too many who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. Be in 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The amazing Spider-Talk, the amazing Spider-Talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the amazing Spider-Talk.
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavoston, and I'm the founder and editor of SuperiorSpiderTalk.com. Thanks for joining me for a special episode of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. We hope you enjoy this podcast and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans, collectors, and creators as we look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture. On this week's show, I promised that I'd be giving you all Episode 3 of the second season of our show. But over the past week and a half, I've come down with flu-like symptoms that made recording an episode a bit difficult. Luckily, I was able to record a bonus episode for everyone a few weeks back as a request made by our Patreon subscriber, Scott McElroy. But before we get to that episode, I've got homework for all of our listeners out there, and that means you. But don't worry, I think you're really going to like this homework. But what do I know? I'm a school teacher. First up, I wanted to tell you all about our brand new community, the Amazing Spider Slack. You see, ever since we changed up our format to the show, I've wanted to find a way to get back in touch with all of our listeners to find out what they thought about Spider-Man comics, video games, movies, their own collections, and our show. So, with a bit of work and beta testing with our Patreon community, I decided to launch the Amazing Spider Slack. It's a Slack community that operates very similarly to a message board, but one that you can participate with on our mobile phones and computers. Just by signing in, you can share all your thoughts about the new comic issues, photos of a new toy you've bought, or even find a way to trade and buy comics. It's already been a ton of fun to talk with our Patreon community, and now I want to invite you guys to all join in. Just click on the link in this episode's show notes to join. I can't wait to see you all on the Amazing Spider Slack and get to know you all better. On a completely separate note, I also wanted to tell you all about a project that I've been facilitating over the past few months with a few of the contributors to SuperiorSpiderTalk.com. You may remember Kane Winstead as one of our guests on the show from several months back, but Kane and I have been talking about launching a new podcast show as part of our podcasting network. We've discussed a lot of ideas, and now the show is ready for you to listen to. So I want to encourage you to all go to iTunes and subscribe to the newest podcast member of the Amazing Spider Talk family called The Untold Talks of Spider-Man. Yes, on the Untold Talks of Spider-Man show, Kane and his co-host Matt will be discussing all the books that Mark and I have never discussed on this show. Books that are incredible deep dives in the Spider-Man library that may have been overlooked after all these years. So basically, just think of it like our Essentials episodes, but with the spotlight attuned towards books that are anything but essential, and you'll get an idea of what the show is like. So again, go check out the Untold Talks of Spider-Man podcast on iTunes. Listen to the first episode and get an idea for yourself. I hope you like it and that you invite Kane and Matt into our podcasting family with a very warm welcome. Speaking of a warm welcome, on today's show, I'm going to be talking to one of my very favorite people on the internet, none other than Chris Baker. Chris has had a varied career weaving in and out of the world of video games, but his one constant is working on Spider-Man games. I just got word that I'll be traveling to E3 this year to cover the new Spider-Man PS4 game, so I thought there would be no better time to bring Chris on to discuss with him the legacy of Spider-Man storytelling in video games over the years. So let's stop dilly-dallying and get right to the conversation. Well, welcome back, listeners. Today, I am joined by my friend, it's weird to say, my friend Chris Baker, who I've talked with number of times but never really like this. So, Chris, welcome on the show. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. It is a pleasure to be here. We have been internet friends for, 3 years or so now, and now we're actually finally talking with voices, which I find pretty neat. But
you did drop my name in a video conversation recently.
Yes, I did. Mistakenly, but I did. I guess I can talk to that in a second. But to answer your question, my name's Chris Baker. I've been in the video game industry for about 20 years now, pretty close to it. And a lot of that was actually at Marvel. I was in the Marvel's games division for about 7 years, from 2007 to 2014. I've also worked at LucasArts, where I was in PR, and I've also worked at the official U.S. PlayStation magazine, where I was kind of got my start from 2000 to late 2004 as an editor there. I've also worked at Gazillion, who made the Marvel Heroes game, may it rest in peace. And I'm currently contracting in the industry. I've been working with Zen Studios lately. They make some really great Pinball FX tables. So that's a really quick version of what I've done. I've written a book about video games, retro superhero video games called Wrong Retro Games You Messed Up Our Comic Book Heroes, which, as the stupidly long title suggests, is about how retro video games did not necessarily treat their source material incredibly faithfully.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's certainly on the agenda here for sure. And I also run a YouTube channel now called Superhero Video Games, which is about superhero video games, believe it or not. And
I don't. I just don't. I flat out refuse to believe it.
Yeah, and I recently, to speak back to what Dan here just said, I meant to say Dan Gilvason in a video, who was the voice of Spider-Man in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, but I said Dan Gavosden in the video, which, I might be talking to the superior Dan right now. I've met Gilvason once. He was a nice guy. He signed a thing that I had, like a little cell from the Amazing Friends era. But yeah, I've been listening to you probably for longer, actually.
Wow, that's
4 years.
That's pretty amazing.
I think I've got more Gavosden in my head than Gilvason.
Well, in a Freudian slip, it was proven true.
Indeed.
It's funny you say that, because it's not the first time. I've had several people make the same slip up, I guess in the world of Spider-Man and Dan's with weird G last names. I'm not unique.
You're the only Gavosden I've ever talked to, and he's the only Gilvason I've ever met. So it is quite the coincidence you're both Dans.
I may have to kill him. So, you talk on your show all the time about the Spider-Man games, some of which you've even worked on. Mm-hmm. And, I've wanting to have you on the show for such a long time, and my laziness has finally subsided. And here you are. And I said, I don't want to run through the same conversation you've had a million times regarding these games. So I said, why don't you pick something for us to talk about? And sure. It seems like you've kind of gone back to your book in a way. Why don't you tell the fine listeners at home what we're going to be talking about today?
A little bit. I mean, I think this is, in a way, it's kind of a history of Spider-Man games, but I didn't want to just come here with a list, like going through a chronology. Actually, my friends at the Retronauts podcast did that recently. You guys should listen to that. But what I've kind of done, just because, this PS4 game's coming out, Spider-Man, Marvel's Spider-Man is what it's officially called.
I haven't heard about it. No, I'm just kidding. Everybody is going nuts about this thing.
It could wind up being the biggest release of the year, which is pretty crazy when it comes to Spider-Man. I mean, I'm sure like Call of Duty and stuff will challenge it. It always does. But it's really refreshing to see a Spider-Man game getting this much attention. And one of the cool things that they're doing in the game that they've talked about is they're creating their own Spider-Man universe, which, says to me that they're putting a lot of thought into, what's going into this game. It's almost, I don't know that much about it yet. None of us really do, but it feels to me like they're kind of going back to what Bendis and Bagley did with Ultimate, and kind of reinterpreting the Spider-Man stuff we all know and love for the 2018 audience.
And like you do when you're reinventing the Spider-Man universe, you start with Mr. Negative.
Exactly. I always kind of wanted to use him in a game. It just never worked out. We slipped him into Edge of Time, and the Amazing Spider-Man 2 he's mentioned. There's like a couple mentions. I actually have a video about the very short history of Mr. Negative in video games.
I love Mr. Negative. I think he's one of the overlooked villains, although I feel like he's been handled kind of strangely back and forth over the years.
That is true. And as far as the game's concerned, they've kind of insinuated that he may not actually be the main villain in the game, that he's, so far as we're recording this in February 2018, all we've really seen is Mr. Negative. We've gotten a hint of Kingpin, a hint of Shocker, and we know Osborn is mayor.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually, I haven't actually gotten around to telling you what the structure is here that
let's
put
do
together.
That.
But all that in mind, all that kind of universe stuff in mind, I thought it'd be cool to go back through the history of games and kind of like look at the different approaches to universe that they've taken. It just kind of, I guess, to outline what those kind of buckets I've created here. There's direct adaptations, which actually kind of directly adapt something so that you're playing that comic story, you're playing that movie, whatever. There's like comic flavored games that are kind of like what you'd expect to fit in the 616 universe. It's not canon and never has been regarded as canon, but it could fit there if you really wanted it to. Then there are games that kind of exist in the universe, some of which were actually billed to be part of canon. And then also, actually, I think that's it. Yeah, those are the main categories here. So yeah, let's start with direct adaptations. Is now a good time to start talking about that, Dan?
I don't see a better time to.
All right. Yeah, so these are games that kind of attempted to take an actual story, whether it was a comic book story we all know and love, or was completely random in some cases, or movies. Specifically a certain trilogy that we'll talk about here.
Yeah.
So early on, we had this game called The Return of the Sinister Six, which most people know as a Nintendo game. It also came out, I think, on Game Gear and maybe Sega Master System or something like that. So that game, actually, on its back of box, it says, based on the actual Marvel comic book series. Actually, let me rephrase that. Based on an actual Marvel comic book series. Return of the Sinister Six. Those of you who know your Spidey will know that this was a story called The Return of the Sinister Six. What are the issues? I've got it right here. Oh, yeah. Amazing Spider-Man 334 through 339. Yes, the Amazing Spider-Man 334 through 339, which was kind of the long-awaited sequel of the Sinister Six coming back together, returning, if you will.
But even then, not really, because you've got a couple of like weird additions and in the Hobgoblin. It always amazed me, kind of first diving into Spider-Man lore when I first did, because I started reading shortly after the story, just how long it took to return to the Sinister Six within the pages of Spider-Man. We kind of accept them as, like a staple of the Spider-Man genre, but really, they were gone for over 300 issues. It's pretty,
I agree. I don't think I even realized that actually till I wrote my book 3 years ago, and I went to this game, and yeah, this is the first time they've been back in like almost 30 years. It's been that long. It's 20 something years. Yeah, and so yeah, this was quite the return. So like I said, it was based on what was the phrasing? Based on an actual Marvel comic book series. You would think, based on the title, The Return of the Sinister Six, that it's based on The Return of the Sinister Six. But if you recall, if you've read it, the whole kind of mentality Doc Ock had in that story was like, when we did this the first time, we all kind of took him on one by one, and that was stupid. Let's all do it. Let's just gang up on him. That was like a really short version of what his plan was.
It took me 30 years, but I figured out our mistake.
But in this game, you're doing what you did in Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1. the annual that matters most.
It does matter the most. You hear that, Mark? You're not here to defend yourself right now.
Yes. Yeah, so basically it even ends in a castle, which Doc had a castle at the end of that for whatever reason. So yeah, you take them on one by one, level by level. It's a terrible game. You don't need to play it. Look it on YouTube or something.
I have not played it. Do you fight Doc Ock in a fishbowl at the end?
In a fishbowl? I don't recall if there's a fishbowl involved, but I know there is a castle that's like his stronghold or whatever.
All right.
Yeah. So that was the first attempt at like a direct adaptation, which I don't think really succeeded in any way. But a few years later, there was a game that's very important to my Spider-Man fandom called Spider-Man and Venom in Maximum Carnage. This was possibly the most faithful direct adaptation of a comic book story ever, because the entire events of the comic, of the game, were directly guided by what happened in the comic. Whether it was Spider-Man or whether it was Venom, you could actually at times kind of choose which character you wanted to follow, and you would go Spider-Man's path or Venom's path, and it's actually a slightly different game depending on which way you decide to go. So they actually would take like panels from the actual Maximum Carnage story and recreate them in the game, and it had a really kind of slick cutscene presentation, which I hadn't really seen in terms of like kind of a comic book style up to that point. So that was pretty cool. The game itself, I thought was a pretty good kind of final fight rip-off kind of thing, just punch and kick kind of stuff.
Don't forget Green Jelly's score. That was the real driving force behind this.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of cool. The score is really good. They have a song called Carnage Rules. Green Jelly, if you don't remember, you probably know them best from the song Three Little Pigs, if you know them at all. They're basically Guar Jr., I guess you could say, in some ways. They get up in makeup and all that. But yeah, so they had a song called Carnage Rules. It's actually a pretty cool song, and it was adapted as well as 16-bit systems could do that. And actually, when I worked on Marvel Heroes years and years later, we put Carnage as a team-up character in the game, so he would tag along with you. And we actually made a trailer about that, and we talked to Green Jelly, and we got their actual music to use in the trailer, which I was pretty proud of.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I basically was exchanging emails with Green Jelly, and in a matter of like 4 days, I think we put that together. It was pretty crazy. Yeah.
Whenever I use Green Jelly's music on the show, I get several emails about it. Like this,
oh, cool.
The fandom for Green Jelly is alive and functioning.
I think for that game, and by proxy for Green Jelly from that game.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a really good YouTube channel called Panels to Pixels that, as we record this, I know is working on something specifically about the music in that game, which I'm looking forward to hearing or seeing that. Anyway, so yeah, the Maximum Carnage was an okay game with a really good representation of the Spider-Man comics. Spider-Man isn't necessarily a guy who just goes around punching people, and that's what that game was. So in that sense, it wasn't really the greatest Spider-Man representation.
And he was very low to the ground in that game.
Yeah, he wall crawled. He did wall crawl. You could web sling, like do just a simple swing on the screen. You had a decent repertoire of moves.
I have to admit that I had this game in the beautiful red cartridge that it was in, a favorite of my collection, and I was terrible at this game. I don't think I ever got past like the third level.
It's hard.
Yeah, it was really hard. And I think, I had recently started buying Spider-Man comics at the time, and because I so wanted to know what happened in the story of this game, I went out and bought, the Maximum Carnage comics, which was exactly what Marvel wanted me to do, I'm sure, or vice versa, and vice versa, more likely. And it really kind of, I mean, at the time they were pushing Maximum Carnage so hard, it really like upped the mystique of this thing in a way that's like it's pretty much unheard of these days. Like, could you imagine a video game being produced about one story arc in Spider-Man? Like, I would love a superior Spider-Man game, but that kind of reality seems so divorced from the current culture we're in.
Yeah, I don't really see that. I see influence from comics. I don't see adaptations really happening much anymore. But so actually, this game right here, I mentioned earlier it was kind of impactful on me. It kind of made me a Spider-Man fan because I liked it so much. And the animated series, I think, came out slightly after this did. And it was like, that was just like, the beginning of me going from like, hey, I always liked Spider-Man. I think just as someone who likes superheroes, you like Spider-Man. But I didn't really know his universe and all that until, I started getting into this. And this game like introduced me to like Cloak and Dagger and Iron Fist and Deathlock, a lot of random characters.
That's how I felt about the Maximum Carnage series. It's like, it's a who's who of who's who.
Yeah. Yeah, people seem to really love or hate that series. There's like no in between. To me, I didn't read it really actually until just a couple years ago. I never actually read that story because the game did it for me. I did find some interesting discrepancies. Like, for example, at one point, Spider-Man gets really pissed in the comic, and he's like, "You devils! I'm not going to take this anymore," or something like that. I guess devils was too religious or something.
Wow.
In the game, it says, "You animals, I'm not going to take this anymore."
Oh, how interesting.
There's like some really odd changes they made if you take a close look at it. But a year after Maximum Carnage came its sequel, which is called Venom Spider-Man Separation Anxiety. Venom got the top billing in this one.
Huh. Do you have any idea why?
Well, Separation Anxiety is a Venom story arc, so I think that's one reason. And he's fighting all the symbiote spawns that came after him, like Scream and all them. Those are pretty much all your bosses. So it's an entire game of symbiotes. The thing is, it tried to present itself as an adaptation of Separation Anxiety. It had nothing to do with Separation Anxiety. It had a lot more to do with Lethal Protector, which was the first Venom series. But they made some changes in their own limited story that kind of went more along with Separation Anxiety, and it ended up just being a mess. And it was a big downgrade from Maximum Carnage because it didn't have like the animated cutscenes. It was just like a wall of text that you would see. And it was just like, it did give you 2-player that the first game didn't have, but other than that, it was just a huge step back, and it was really disappointing.
It's funny because when I was a kid, I like never owned this game. I would rent it from Blockbuster, and it had this kind of allure to it where I thought this was a superior game. And I think it was really mostly owed to that 2-player because I could actually get further in the game because I could convince my brother to help me out because we were so easier. Terrible. Yeah. It just, I felt like it was a better game because it was easier. Not that that's an actual reflection on quality.
Right. Yeah. I remember it being very, very much easier. I could beat it. I could not beat Maximum Carnage. Maybe in that regard, it is superior. But they pretty much gave you the same moveset and everything. So it was a pretty bad adaptation, whereas Maximum Carnage was a pretty great just adaptation. And then the other kind of just straight adaptations where you're playing something that exists is the 3 Sam Raimi movie games. They all kind of had slightly different approaches. Like the first one was very level based, but it started with the whole tracking down. Well, it's all of these games kind of expand upon what is actually presented because it's a 2-hour movie and it's going to be like an 8 to 10 hour game typically, right? So the first one was an adaptation of the Green Goblin story, and it actually threw in new villains like Shocker and a couple other ones. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but it kind of felt a little too Green Goblin-ish toward the end, as I recall, because it was like the first half of the game was Spidey fighting, people like Shocker, and Vulture was another one, had a pretty cool looking cityscape there. And you just went through the story of Spider-Man. At the end, you saved Mary Jane from the bridge, and Green Goblin dies the same way he dies in the movie. So they definitely just tried to straight adapt the movie to game. And Spider-Man 2, which is an all-time favorite of a lot of Spider-Man game fans, it was also the story of Dr. Octopus with even more new villains thrown in, like Mysterio. But that one stands out for its open world, which was pretty revolutionary. This was shortly after Grand Theft Auto 3, which was the revolutionary game in terms of open worlds. And but the web swinging in it is still the best there's been to date.
I might take argument with that, but we'll hold that when we get to, I think, the one that holds a candle to it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I would say the popular consensus is that it is still the best web swinging to date.
That's fair.
And I think I know what game you're thinking of, and I might agree with you. But it is when it went from Spider-Man 2, I'm getting off a tangent here, but I think it's pretty relevant. When we went from Spider-Man 2 to Ultimate Spider-Man, which was the next game, which we'll talk about in a bit, I've been told that Spider-Man 2's web swinging was almost too good, and that if you're not like a hardcore gamer, then the physics were just too hard to master. So they kind of simplified it from there, and it's kind of existed in various states ever since. But, a lot of people contend that Spider-Man 2 has the best web swinging ever, and I think that's one of the reasons or the main reason that it is as highly revered as it is. And Spider-Man 3, I've never played. I'll just say that, but I have watched footage and stuff. It's Spider-Man 3.
It famously also got really bad reviews.
Yes, it was in that awkward transition between generations. We were going from PS2 and Xbox, original Xbox, not Xbox One, to the 360 and the PS3. So as a result, whenever you're in that stage and you're making the same game for multiple systems, the one that should be the best is compromised. It's just the way it works, unfortunately, and it always happens at the beginning of a console generation, which this was.
It seemed to me almost that it was unfinished largely. Like that's
very possible.
That seemed to be it had the tie-in with the movie, which is kind of the struggle of these kind of movie adaptations, is they often push these release dates to correspond when the market's hot, and we live in a time, and I think that time isn't so discordant with today, that developers are often pushing back release dates to perfect things, and we've kind of settled into that groove, which is where some of these later adaptations kind of really work, because they don't have to feel this slavish need to tie it in. I mean, even Maximum Carnage, right, I'm sure, felt the need to put this game out to correspond with the release of the comic in some way.
Yeah, movie adaptations, that's always one of the struggles for sure. But yeah, actually, it's one thing that Spider-Man 3 did do well in terms of expanding the universe. It has a really cool kind of alternate take on the Scorpion. I've only watched YouTube videos of this, but in terms of just kind of sheer story and expanding the universe as these games tend to do, it had a really interesting take where Scorpion was kind of like not a genetic experiment, I want to say like a kind of cyborg type experiment gone wrong, kind of changed Matt Gargan's attitudes and everything. And he was like a good guy going in, and then just the stuff that happened, he became kind of a sympathetic bad guy. So that was pretty cool. I know Kingpin's in there. I don't really remember what his extent was. But it again, just adapting the story for the most part from start to the nice end with Venom and the huge Sandman, and you actually played as the new Goblin a little bit.
What do you think about this approach to like adapting comics to video games or movies to video games? Is this we expressed a little bit earlier that it seems like something that's really separate from what we kind of media environment regarding video games we exist in today. Do you think that it will likely not return to this kind of format?
I think it will exist as a Lego game moving forward from now on, like that format. There was a time when if there was a big blockbuster coming out, you could pretty much always anticipate a video game to go with it, and very often it was a straight adaptation, maybe expanding a little bit. But that day has passed. People just stopped buying them, and the game is only as if you do that, then the game can only be as good in terms of story as the movie that it represents. And a lot of times the movies are, they do fine, they don't do great. So the game isn't necessarily something people are clamoring for. And I think people started to realize as games got more and more kind of sophisticated and actually had stories, I think it took a long time for people to figure it out, but they really wanted something more that wasn't just a direct adaptation. That said, I do think that like a comic book adaptation would be more interesting because really only your hardcore comic fans will have read them. I think something like a Spider Island, for example, was just tailor made to be a video game.
Yeah, no kidding.
And in some ways you can. It was actually funny. Well, we'll talk about this later because it's about another game that I worked on. But yeah, I think that's about all there is to say about the kind of adaptations.
I'll say my dream Spider-Man game would fall into this category. I would love to see like an episodic, really released Spidey game that would update its art style based on the writer who was operating the book at any given time. Like, if I could play a game where I played as Ditko's Spider-Man for a while through several adventures there, and then a game that played through Romita's and so on, it would be so hardcore and nerdy. But like, wow, what that would be! If I had a dream game to develop,
sure,
that would be the one. Like, can each level be an issue and kind of thing? That would be super sublime, and no one would ever make it. But a boy can dream.
Yeah, I do think there's room for taking maybe stories that are in comics and in, like, say, the Spider-Man PS4 game, that's a nice open world game. You're going to need a lot of side quests and stuff. I think you could adapt like popular stories and make them missions, just not what the game's about, but just like a side mission that you don't even have to do if you don't want to.
I feel like if they were smart as developers and wanted to have DLC that had like a built-in fan base that would want to buy it, like buying your favorite comic or select comic issues where you are like fighting your way out of a flooding building or any number of these stories could be really exciting as almost like a nostalgia play.
Oh yeah, I agree. The kind of resistance you'd get there is like how many people who actually really know those really old stories are playing video games. And you could do stuff with newer stories. Yeah. But then, like, how many people, like, what percentage of the audience that plays this game is actually reading comics and cares about that? I don't have those numbers, but I actually suspect they're not very big.
I will confirm with you that they're not very big. Yeah, the average issue of Spider-Man sells like 70,000 copies, maybe.
Right.
We love comics, but the audience of actual legally purchased comic readers is a dwindling number, I think.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it has gone to trades, and digital comics bought and 99-cent Comixology sales and stuff like that. Marvel Unlimited, all that kind of stuff. I think the audience is more than just the 70,000 people who buy an issue, but it's still a fraction of what a successful game audience would be.
Yeah, no kidding.
So you're gonna have a nice base there if you take that approach, and I think there's still a lot of people who would be like, "Oh, cool! I hear this is based on an actual comic series. Maybe it actually gets them to go back and read it." But in terms of being a selling point, it'd have to be a really strong concept.
So next up, you wanted to talk about the comic flavored games. Now, this isn't like a Doritos chip flavor. Go into what you mean by comics flavored games.
So comic flavored games are games that, if you wanted to throw them into a certain point of Spider-Man continuity, you probably could. There's tons of spectacular Spider-Man issues and whatnot that no one remembers that are technically part of his canon. But I recently learned that Spider-Man turned into Hulk at one point.
Yeah, the Spider Hulk.
2 points. There's 2 points in Spider-Man where he's turned into a Hulk. I didn't know that until recently.
And Captain Universe.
Yeah, well, Captain Universe actually comes up as an alternate costume pretty often. I don't think people know what it means, but yeah, that is something that gamers actually kind of know about through alternate costumes.
That's true.
But I think this is basically this category, comic flavored. I'm calling it is kind of your games that are obviously based on the comics universe, but don't really have a firm place, and they date back all the way to the beginning, which is Spider-Man for Atari 2600, and that is basically the Green Goblin has bombs, and Spider-Man has to climb up a building and stop him. It's an Atari game, so it's pretty simple. I do contend that it is one of the more playable today Atari games that are out there. It's still kind of fun if you know what you're in for.
Your description makes it sound like Donkey Kong. Is that a far reach?
It is kind of like Donkey Kong.
Okay.
That was actually going to be the next thing I was going to say. Was it does have a very Donkey Kong flavor to it. The Green Goblin is at the very top of a building. Spider-Man's got he doesn't wall crawl. The wall crawler does not wall crawl at all in this game, but he shoots webs, and the webs cannot hit windows. For whatever reason, his webbing in this particular version is it's going to slip off of windows. But if
you don't know the number one Spider-Man rule, don't hit the windows.
I guess not. Yeah, so you got to make your way up the building, and there's thugs. I don't know. I can't remember if they're thugs or if they're people to rescue, but you can touch them, and you're either putting them in their place as thugs or you're rescuing them as people. I think it's thugs. But you work your way to the top.
It's a big distinction.
Yeah, well, it's just the shape of a person in a window. So
there you
use
go.
your imagination.
Atari.
Yeah, and then you get to the top and you disarm the bomb, and you go to another level, and you keep going and going because that's what Atari games did. One kind of cool thing about this game is, back then, now you have these teams of 100 plus people that work on top tier games. This was, I think mainly one person with music help from another person, and that was a woman in a very male-dominated field at the time. Her name is I forgot her name off the top of my head, but she is very. It's like the only game she ever made, I think, and it's just pretty cool. I think that the very first ever Spider-Man game was developed by one person. It was a woman, and it was for a company called Parker Brothers, which is pretty appropriate.
That's funny.
Although there's only one Parker, but what are you going to do?
Well, no, now there's multiple.
Oh, that's right.
Don't forget about Kane Parker.
Yeah, that's true. Back then there wasn't.
Okay, all right.
Also, this game has a really great commercial. You should check that out at some point on YouTube. I made a video about it too. Going fast forwarding a few years, Spider-Man the Videogame is what this one game was called. It was in the arcade from Sega. I think it does a really good job of kind of capturing the color of a comic book. It still has a really kind of cool look to it. It came out in 1991. It's all sprite based, so it doesn't look like a PlayStation 1 kind of 3D model or something like that doesn't really hold up today.
It looks really good for 1991.
Yeah, it does. And if you go back and play it, it's just punch, 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 and then there's some like platforming sections, and then it's a 4-player game. Do you know what the other playable characters are, Dan?
Is Venom a playable character? He's like the first villain.
No, yeah, Venom is the first and last villain. He actually comes back at the end, right after you beat Dr. Doom. You go to Latveria, which the game calls Latvelia.
There you go.
It's made in Japan.
Okay, I'm gonna guess Black Cat.
Yes.
Okay. Those are the only two I played with my wife. We played it in an arcade a few months back.
The other two are so closely associated with Spider-Man, though. Hawkeye and Namor.
Of course. How many of those were leftovers from the Avengers game they'd made?
Well, Sega didn't make that, so it was all new stuff. Although, both of those did appear in the Avengers game that same year. So you could play as Spider-Man, Hawkeye, Namor, and Black Cat. They all basically had the same moveset in different ways. Spider-Man had a web-slinging move, and Black Cat used a grappling hook, and I don't remember what Namor and Hawkeye did exactly, but everybody kind of played the same. But you went through and you just beat up on Scorpion and Green Goblin and a nice menagerie of Spider-Man villains, and it had Kingpin and it had Dr. Doom was the supposed main villain, and then Venom comes back. This was the first time I saw Venom actually as a person, because I wasn't really reading the comics back then, and he was a really new character at the time, and he does some things in the game that are not really a Venom kind of thing to do. Like he becomes like the size of like Godzilla or something like that.
Well, time out. You must not have read Venom Inc. yet.
Oh, I haven't.
Spoilers for Venom Inc.
Is Venom Inc. An adaptation of this game?
It may just be. We might have to change the column that this game is in now. But
that's fantastic.
You mentioned the Godzilla-sized Venom. Like, this is to continue our theme. I was also not very good at this game, or never had enough quarters to get past giant Godzilla-sized Venom, which admittedly is like the third level of the game.
Oh, yeah, that's like the first level. It's like 5 minutes in.
I never had enough quarters, I gotta say.
Yeah, I never actually beat it myself. I've just looked on YouTube. YouTube's a great source for just looking at games in their entirety, even though they completely break copyright law if you want to get down to it. But it's really good for research, that's for sure. So then there was a game also from Sega around that time called, at first it was just called Spider-Man, and it came out on the Sega Genesis. And then a few years later, they remade the game on the Sega CD, which, at the time was a huge advance because you could have like CD quality sound, and you could actually hear people talk and not just like a digitized way. It was like real people, using words that were recorded like you would in games today.
Just not as well written as games today.
Yeah, and not as well acted.
Yeah, that's
not by a long shot.
Yeah.
And in fact, in this game, I'm pretty sure that about half of the voices are all Cam Clark, who I guess he's still around, but he was around a lot, like in the 90s and 2000s. Gamers know him as Liquid Snake, probably best of all, from Metal Gear. And I think he was He-Man in that 2002 series. He's done a lot. You'd know his voice if you heard it, and I think he's like half of the voices in the game, including Spider-Man, who talks kind of like this, like, you know, like almost like your stereotypical generic superhero.
Hi, I'm Joe Smith.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, we hadn't really figured out that, you know, kind of the young and playful was the way to go with him. But yeah, what the Sega CD game did, which was interesting, was it was at its core, it was the Sega Genesis game that had come out before it, but all of these kind of extra bells and whistles kind of made it a whole new game. And, you know, it put you in, obviously, your Kingpin was the final boss. And then, you know, you had your characters that you fought along the way. You know, I think Vulture's in there. I know even when guarding Kingpin in this version that was not in the Genesis version, it had Typhoid Mary and Bullseye, which was pretty cool, which is more of a Daredevil thing, but it still fit with Kingpin. But yeah, so that was a pretty cool representation. Also, this version has a really awesome like hair metal theme that's done by a guy named Eric Martin, who people probably know best as Mr. Big from the song To Be With You. I'm the one who wants to be with you, that song. It's like a really rockin' hair rock song that came out you know, when we were all into grunge, so it was a little late anyway, but it's a really cool, fun thing to listen to. You can listen to the whole thing on YouTube as well.
Spare no expense on these Spider-Man soundtracks.
Exactly. And then we jumped to 2000. By the way, this whole thing is not comprehensive. I want to make that clear, because if it was comprehensive, we'd be here for hours and hours and hours, whereas, you know, we want to make this listenable. But yeah, jumping ahead to 2000 comes what I believe is the most single important Spider-Man game, which is Spider-Man by Neversoft for Activision on the PlayStation 1 and then also on the Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and PC. Most people, I think, know it's a PlayStation game. This game was really just a love letter to Spider-Man, and, you know, unlike Spider-Man versus the Kingpin, which did have voices and everything, this was really the first time it was like a really kind of production, like with really high quality voice talent. And, you know, it wasn't a super long game, but it took you through a really cool story that included lots of signature villains. It ended, and I'm sorry for a spoiler for a very old game here, but it ended with Dr. Octopus merging with the Carnage symbiote, which was pretty cool. And
the Red Octopus.
Was he actually called that?
No, I'm just joking.
I'll go with that.
Because the big plot line right now is that Norman Osborn has merged with the Carnage symbiote and is now the Red Goblin. So
right.
There you go.
So the Red Octopus, as we will call him, pursues Spider-Man to the end of the game, and it's got a lot of cool cameos in there. It's got Punisher, it's got Captain America, it's got Daredevil. It had a whole like what if mode, which had just got weird, like gave characters big heads and stuff, and
Black Cat looked the same in What If because she already looked weird.
Yeah, that's true. She was not a very well. It was PlayStation 1, so the best you could really do with a female model back then was like the kind of Lara Croft, like kind of pointy breast kind of thing. It was a little better on Dreamcast, I'll say.
I owned it on Dreamcast, so
okay.
And I still own it on Dreamcast. Funnily enough.
Cool. Well, you should. It's great.
I loved this game. I share the same affinity for it that I think you do. Mm-hmm. Which every time you talk about this game, I'm like, yeah, he is 100% right. And you had the honor of reviewing this game, correct?
I sure did. Yeah. Gave it a 5 out of 5 in the official U.S. PlayStation magazine, and I still stand by that. It generally got like 8s and 9s for the most part, and our review is subjective. So I really love Spider-Man, and I'm going to give it that extra.
How hard was it to give it that score in the magazine? Was there pushback?
I wouldn't say there was pushback. There was a little bit of questioning afterwards, maybe a little bit daring from the. I worked down the hall from Electronic Gaming Monthly, which was actually the magazine I grew up reading, other than Nintendo Power, and they gave it like 7 5s and 8s, I think, which is still pretty good. Everyone acknowledged it was a good game. I think I liked it more than they did, but.
I loved it. I mean, by the very fact that you could web sling across rooftops and climb up walls, I was like 100% sold.
Yeah,
I can't remember.
Definitely felt. Sorry. They definitely had the Spidey feel more than any game for sure.
I can't remember. Was this the one to introduce like light stealth into the Spider-Man world?
I don't think there was much stealth going. Oh, there was a little bit. Yeah, there was like a level where. There was like a bank robbery and you stuck to the ceiling and, you would go basically hop down on guys. So, yeah, there was a degree of stealth. It was not like what it would be in some later games that we'll talk about here shortly. But, yeah, there was a degree there for sure.
I remember a particularly frustrating office level where you're like dropping out of the shadows from the ceiling. Is that this game or am I mixing...
That is it. That's actually exactly what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. When I was back then, I was working on the magazine. The person who showed it to us was a guy named TQ Jefferson. He now works at Skybound on Walking Dead stuff. But he worked at Activision at the time, and it was his production. He was a producer on the game. We kind of bonded at that point because he was a huge Spider-Man fan. Maybe even bigger than me. And he, we kept in touch over the years because we had this Spidey bond, right? Spider Brothers.
Like you did, yeah.
Then 8 years later, he'd become my boss at Marvel, and he was the VP of games there from like 2008 to 2014. So, he was my friend, and then he was my boss, and that was pretty cool.
That is cool.
But he had a saying for that particular level that was evil never looks up. Because you basically spent that particular level on the ceiling, plopping down on guys when you could. But that was his saying for that, which I still to this day find pretty funny because it kind of holds true whenever you're in that situation in any game, whether it's Spider-Man or not. Batman, Arkham Asylum, that kind of stuff. Evil never looks up.
I have a phrase for that level in most Spider-Man games, which is evil is crawling on the ceiling. Because controls on the ceiling were always fraught with incredible difficulty.
Yeah, the camera in that game was its biggest fault, definitely. And yeah, especially when you're on the ceiling. Yeah. It's a hard thing to get right. Because we as human beings do not do that.
And does it invert your joystick? I could never remember. Is up, is down, down? What is up and down when you're Spider-Man?
Right. Yeah, fine questions, all of those. But yeah, that had a sequel. It wasn't as good, called Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro. That's an interesting game because this is get a little heavy here, but the last level in that game was modified because the last level in that game was originally the Twin Towers.
Oh.
This game came out, I believe it was October 2001. And I reviewed that game as well. I reviewed it like in August. So the version I played actually had the Twin Towers in it. And then, we had September 11th, awful day. And that it's one of those weird things where they were like, well, we got to change this. And so I think if you play it now, it's like one kind of conjoined building, but that is very awkward. But the game itself was kind of more the same, just with not quite as cool villains. Like it had like kind of like the Rhino stage, but it had Hammerhead charging at you. Hammerhead's okay, I guess, but Rhino's cooler, and it was a bunch of that kind of stuff. So that was a 3.5 out of 5 to me back then. I remember.
Oh, okay. You recall that story of the Twin Towers? It reminds me a lot of the the early teaser for the Raimi movie.
Yeah,
that saw Spider-Man catching the crooks in the web between the towers.
Yeah, it was a great teaser. It
makes me wonder. Maybe you have some. I'm sure you have some insight on this. This kind of like the pacing of these games. Were these right before the Raimi games? It seemed like there was a real quick quantity of these games coming out around the time of that first movie.
Yeah, well, Activision had the license and they wanted to use it, so they would pump out something pretty much every year for a while there. The first game was 2000, then this one was 2001, then 2002 you'd have the first movie game. I guess they took a year off, and the second movie game, then that they kind of went with the cadence of the movies at that point. But yeah, they had the license and they wanted to use it, and they took
I don't blame them.
Yeah, and they treated it well. I don't think Spider-Man 2 was as good, but it was also kind of in a weird transition between PS1 and PS2. PS1 was still very relevant, but PS2 was out, and so this was not Activision's priority at that point. The PS2 was, and they were already, I'm sure, making the movie game that Treyarch would come out with. The Spider-Man 2 came out, and it was fine. I think, in my review, I said, strangely enough, lightning doesn't strike twice for the Electro game.
Well, look at you.
Yeah, I know. Or some kid really liked that. They wrote in there I really liked what you said, and that just stuck with me. I think that's the only reason I remember even saying that. But yeah, so let's flash forward a few more years. Still in this comic flavored kind of category. My first Spider-Man game I got to work on was Spider-Man Web of Shadows, which among fans today I think is one of the favorites. I get a lot of people, when I started putting out YouTube videos and saying, hey, I used to work on these games, people would be like, dude, I love Web of Shadows. That was my childhood. And it's like, oh, that's cool. Now I feel old. But yeah, so Web of Shadows was very much a Spider-Man and Venom-centric game, with Venom being the ultimate bad guy. He actually gets bigger in this game than he did in that game I talked about earlier at the end. And basically a symbiote invasion happens. By sheer coincidence, the same thing was happening in the comics at the time. There really was no correlation there. Just I don't know if you remember New Avengers back then, but there was a storyline where a symbiote invasion was happening, and that happened right as this game was nearing its end of production. But I just found it really interesting that that those two things just happened.
That is funny.
At the same time. There's another instance of that I'll get to in a bit. And then, so Web of Shadows had a lot of cool cameos like Luke Cage, Moon Knight. And with this symbiote invasion, it also kind of featured traditional villains, still being villains in the game, but also eventually being, unlikely allies like Kingpin, Tinker, Vulture. They all eventually joined Spider-Man in the fight against the symbiotes. So it was a really interesting story. And, you could play it out. The big feature of this game was you could switch between the symbiote costume for Spider-Man and his traditional costume. And the symbiote was more powerful and more fun, to be honest. Not that Spider-Man himself wasn't, because this had, I would say, the best combat system that we've seen in a Spider-Man game so far.
Yeah, it was really complex.
Yeah, totally. And there was a huge, robust set of moves. There was one really awesome move where you could just almost spring off of a bad guy off to another guy. It was like a chain of springing off of people that just felt really good. And there were these kind of almost skateboard kind of moves, which makes sense because the developer was called Shaba, and they made a skateboarding game. Not Tony Hawk. What was it called? I forget. But their pedigree was skateboard games. So you can kind of see that too.
And all the Venom stuff was kind of it's like Super Saiyan Spider-Man. It was over the top, crazy symbiote stuff.
Totally. And it did affect his attitude. He was, he was almost Wolverine-ish. And you actually fought a symbiote Wolverine, which I do actually remember feedback coming from New York at the time because, like I said, this new Avenger story was happening. And in that story, the Wolverine rejects the symbiote because of his healing factor. Mm-hmm. So, we basically just took... We didn't know that. Or Activision didn't know that. That was written before that happened. So, we had to stick with that. And no one really called us out on it or anything. But, and Symbiote Wolverine's pretty cool.
And it's one of the highlights of the game. So, there you go.
And you played this one, Dan?
Lightly. Okay. It was never one I owned, but I had a friend who had it. So I got to kind of watch it a lot more than I played it.
Yeah, there's one part in the game I'd love to hear your take on maybe someday. And, a lot of the hardcore Spider-Man fans here probably remembered it if they got that far. It's almost like a Spider-Man quiz because Wolverine encounters Spider-Man in his black suit, I think was the scenario. And he needs to make sure that he's still dealing with Peter because the whole city's like consumed by symbiotes and everybody's going crazy.
Right.
And so he basically asks you things that Wolverine and Spider-Man would know. So like, he asks you about Ned Leeds and a couple of questions about the new Avengers and stuff like that, which, the hardcore fans, like, they really like that, and the people who are just like Spider-Man, they didn't know the answers to these things. It didn't really matter. It was kind of just a cool little Easter egg thing.
What was the name of the woman you murdered in a graveyard with me?
Did that happen? I don't remember that.
Yeah, it did. Spider-Man vs. Wolverine, yeah.
Oh, wow. We did have some stuff in there. Oh, Critical Damage, I think, was a character from that. Do you remember?
Wow.
He's like the Blob, but he has like electric fingers or something.
Yeah, that's
he was a question. Right. Yeah, he was one of the questions. So yeah, that was one of the first things that I had a very active role in. It was like finding all of at the time, actually, there weren't a whole lot of Spider-Man and Wolverine crossover. Not as much as you would think.
Yeah. Call in the nerd. He'll help us with this.
Yeah. And I was still getting my feet wet in terms of like how to research things. I didn't know all the tricks that I know now. So, we did, we got some Marvel Knights stuff in there. It's like, I think, who did we have Punch and Pie with or something? And the answer is Aunt May. But yeah, I think that's something that your audience especially would appreciate.
I'm going to have to find that on YouTube and just take the quiz myself.
Yeah, you should. So yeah, that pretty much covers Web of Shadows. You could go totally evil, by the way. Like you could end the game and be like, the total black suit consumes Spider-Man and he's ruling New York, basically. He's like the ruler of the symbiotes.
What I've always wanted to do.
I think this is the only Spider-Man game where you can basically be an evil Spider-Man at the end, which, I don't know if they'd go back to that. I think, I'm not sure I would have gone back to that in my later years. It's kind of a controversial thing to do that. But I do think it's pretty cool, actually.
That game mechanic was kind of in vogue at the time, too. This kind of good evil
really
meter.
Was.
Yeah,
it really was. Like Knights of the Old Republic and games like that, Fable. A lot of games were like, are you going to be good or are you going to be bad? That was a huge trend at the time. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so a lot of people love that game, and it got kind of mixed reviews at the time. But it seems like, at least among fans, it's a favorite these days.
Yeah, I hear a lot about it, and maybe a lot from you, but I do hear a lot about it all the same.
Check my comments section; you'll see it all the time.
I will.
It's interesting how much that game comes up. And next, I think we'll talk about just quickly talk about Marvel Pinball: The Amazing Spider-Man, which is a game that I was very actively involved with creating, and now I actually work with the company contractually that put it out. But I love the Amazing Spider-Man table and Marvel Pinball and all of them in general. it does a really great job of kind of just highlighting all the major villains. They do stuff like Dr. Octopus walks around the table and picks up your ball. The balls will turn into pumpkin bombs when the Green Goblin is active, and you have to you quote unquote throw them back at him by nailing ramps with the pumpkin bombs. And it's got a lot of kind of cool inventive things. One of my favorite things to tell people about this table is that Dan Slott, writer of Spider-Man last decade, is one of the best Amazing Spider-Man pinball table players in the world.
Wow.
So at some point, I haven't looked in a long time, but at some point in, I'd say probably 2011, 2012, he was like top 50 on Xbox Live, like everyone on Xbox who has played Amazing Spider-Man pinball. He was among the very best. I asked him about it once. He said, yeah, I love that game because you can just like pause it and come back and keep going and, catch your breath. And that was like his secret to being one of the all-time great Spider-Man pinball players.
I would never have guessed that, but I guess I'm both surprised and not that surprised.
Yeah, this was he was probably at his height around Spider Island, I'd imagine.
I'm surprised it hasn't found its way into the comics proper.
I don't know. Maybe you should put it in there. Yeah,
he's got a few more issues to go.
That's true. Maybe that's what his last issue is going to be. He's going to surprise us all and be like, "This is just Amazing Spider-Man Pinball, the comic."
That's interesting. It's all been in a macro universe inside of a pinball table.
He's always talking about the long game. It all takes place in arcades, Murder World Pinball or something.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. I'd buy that, but I'm also contractually obligated to buy everything.
Cool. So yeah, let's just talk about some other ones real quickly here. Spider-Man Unlimited is a mobile game that you can play right now. It's got like over 300 something different versions of Spider-Man now. A lot of them are different characters who play like Spider-Man, but it's like a runner. It's fun. It has a really cool kind of art style to it, very cartoonish. But yeah, like these other ones, it kind of fits in a 616 kind of fashion, but isn't really. So
I definitely had a solid 2 months of obsession with this game.
Yeah, people still do.
They updated it and added like turns into the game, and that's where I checked out because it was like it just suddenly got too random in terms of my skill ability. I was at the top of my game. I was in the top of the rankings on that game, and then they added turns, and I was like, you know what? This is where us old timers check out.
Yeah. So, yeah, one of my favorite games that I worked on was actually Shattered Dimensions, and that I kind of say it's a tie between Shattered Dimensions and the 2000 game as to what my favorite personal game is of Spider-Man game history. Shattered Dimensions, if you don't know, was kind of Spider-Verse, like a very miniature version of Spider-Verse that came out in 2010 on X360 and PlayStation 3. And it joined together, we actually called him the Amazing Spider-Man. And he was voiced by Neil Patrick Harris because Neil Patrick Harris was Spider-Man in the MTV cartoon. And we had Spider-Man 2099, who was voiced by Dan Gavasden, the Amazing Spider-Man. Then we had Ultimate Spider-Man in his black costume. Just the reasoning there was because we wanted to vary up the gameplay more. Because if it's just Ultimate Spider-Man and then just kind of typical Amazing Spider-Man, then those are kind of the same character. So we gave the black costume back to him. And then the fourth one was Noir, which was a pretty new idea at the time. The whole Noir series had kind of just come out when they were when they were creating what they wanted to do with this game. So it combined these four different eras, and they were all on this quest to find shards of a tablet. I forget what the tablet was called. But
life and death or something like that.
Something like that. But yeah, this was actually a story that Dan Slott did bring his name back into things. He did the structure of the story and most of the cutscenes. Some other writers worked on it as well. And I mean, I think it's just a really great kind of look at. It has all your favorite characters in there in some form. Like it has like Noir Goblin, which was interesting. Noir Vulture. We made up some characters like Hobgoblin 2099 was a made up character.
A cool character too.
I thought so. Yeah, because they had something they wanted to do with originally it was just a Goblin 2099, and there is a Goblin 2099 already, and it's kind of a different thing than what they wanted to do. So we were like, hey, just make up Hobgoblin. You know, there's no Hobgoblin there, so make him a little more kind of almost I don't want to say robotic, but he's got kind of a more robotic appearance anyway. He's not robotic, but anyway, he's all shiny.
I like the shiny goblin.
Yeah, and we had a Dr. Octopus that was female from 2099. She was pretty cool. I was exchanging emails with Tom Brevoort back then who's been with Marvel forever as an editor. We kind of helped create him together. You know, and you had like Ultimate Electro, but one of the kind of cool things was, you know, like this is a game that we wanted you to think that maybe it could fit in all of these. And, you know, it didn't really at the time make sense for like Ultimate Spider-Man to have the black suit because he just wanted to get rid of that thing. He never wanted to have that again.
Yeah.
So, you know, we made it. We made an excuse for that to happen. I remember I even went so far as to get super geeky about it and to say, you know, if we wanted to, we could put this like as issue number 100 something .5. Because there was because he got it back later on. And I think we'll talk about this again too. But yeah, so, you know, we put a lot of thought into making things fit.
You could tell Shattered Dimensions is beautifully done. And I think when we're talking about this kind of comic flavored, to me, the comics were never better represented than in Shattered Dimensions.
Cool.
It is, I don't know. I would say it's my favorite, but there's another one we're going to get to that might be my favorite. But I think in terms of just like moment to moment fun, it never got better than Shattered Dimensions.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It was definitely a kind of a tighter experience than something like a Spider-Man 2 was. You know, it didn't have the open world, which is the reason a lot of people don't like it. Because a lot of people, once the open world hit, were like, Spider-Man's always got to be open world. There's no other way to do him. And, you know, I think there's room for both. I think, well, one thing that I think was actually kind of cool, I can relay kind of a behind the scenes story here, I guess, is, you know, there was in development, there was a fight with Juggernaut, which was actually inspired by the classic Juggernaut story from the 80s. And, you know, it's not that exactly, but it's kind of inspired by it. And the way it was initially kind of made was, you know, Spider-Man just kind of beats him up and, you know, that's it. Which, if you know the Juggernaut, it's not really the case, right? Nothing stops the Juggernaut.
Right.
So the way the fiction of this particular game worked was these supervillains were getting hold of the shard pieces that everybody's after, and it was making them more powerful. So the idea that we had to kind of fix that was to make the shard actually counter the power of the Gem of Sidorak. So it made him vulnerable.
That's clever.
And we did that with a line of dialogue. Like it's like Madam Web connects to Spider-Man through, you know, Madam Web powers, whatever those are, and says, you know, the shard is actually countering his powers. You can actually defeat him. Something like that. I think Spider-Man's retort is with great power comes great vulnerability. I did not write that, but I don't know who did, actually. I think that was the secondary writer they had. But
you're making me even more keen to return to this thing.
Yeah, well, stuff like that is the kind of, when it was my job at Marvel to kind of oversee how that things were being presented as they should, it was like, that's the kind of thing I did. And I think that's like a really kind of tangible example, because a lot of it is super small and minuscule and almost boring. But, when you can point to things like that and just, giving creative direction and costumes and stuff like that, like that's one of my kind of go-to examples of something that I did that was a simple change that changed a pretty glaring error that we could not have fixed at that point in development.
You had a lot to do with how Deadpool's presented in this game, correct?
Oh, yeah. Ultimate Deadpool is who it is. And if you've read Ultimate Deadpool, he's really straightforward mercenary. He's not Ryan Reynolds, Nolan North, the meme pool, you could call him today even. He's not funny. And, we wanted Deadpool in the game, but that's not the Deadpool we wanted. Like, that's not like I was saying earlier, a lot of people don't actually read comics. They know the gist of what characters are about, and that's not the Deadpool they know. So we wanted to make him funny.
Even the people that read Ultimate Deadpool don't really like Ultimate Deadpool.
Right. I've actually seen Bendis say, if I could take one thing back, it would be how I handled Deadpool. So what we did with him was, in the story that happens in the comics with Deadpool, is he dies, or at least it's implied that he dies, and then you kind of get this hint that he didn't really die. So we used that as a way to explain that he went crazy and he went loopy, and now he's the Deadpool that you actually like. So, we actually got Nolan North, who at that point I think had only done Hulk Versus, and which was an animated movie, the straight to DVD animated movie that got kind of mixed reviews, but Nolan North in that was a huge success. Everybody loved him. The video compilation of him in Hulk Versus, if you look that up on YouTube, it's in the millions in hits. And that was one of his defining roles. If you don't know, Nolan North is probably the most famous voice actor. Him and like Troy Baker, I think is up there. He's royalty in voice acting. Nathan Drake from Uncharted, and just tons of other roles. There's a funny internet clip of him talking to himself in the game Mafia, like, "Hey, how you doing?" "Oh, I'm doing great." It's like, so yeah, I'd like to think that this game, at least in some ways, made Deadpool at least a little more popular. He was already like a meme superstar at that point. And I remember, like, any Marvel game that would be announced, like the second comment in any story would be, "Is Deadpool in it?" So we put him in this one.
And then there was the Deadpool. There was the Deadpool game, which to me had a very similar vibe to this whole section of this game.
Sure, yeah. That was a very wacky, out there Deadpool that kind of used the three voices in his head that Daniel Way wrote back at that time, and that was super fun to work on as well.
Oh, you also worked on that.
Oh yeah. That and Deadpool Pinball also had Nolan North.
Really awesome. And then, the follow-up to Shattered Dimensions, Edge of Time. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that one gets, it's not as good. I'll say that. But I think it gets a lot of kind of undeserved flack for being like half the game that Shattered Dimensions was. Because Edge of Time had Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, and it had Spider-Man 2099, and that's it. It didn't have any other, didn't have Noir, didn't have Ultimate. So people were like, "Oh, that's half the game." Well, no, I mean, it is a shorter game. That is true. But it's also like a much tighter story with, like, they're actually interacting in this. There was only one scene in the previous game at the very end where the characters interact, which I always kind of regretted. But in this one, which was completely written by Peter David, like, he wrote everything. which is actually pretty rare.
Yeah.
It's usually, kind of split between, his creative direction, like Dan did with, Dan wrote some of Spider-Man Dimensions or Shattered Dimensions 2, and he's offering creative direction in Spider-Man PS4. But it's pretty rare for like one premiere guy to write the whole thing. But Peter David did, and it's a really tight script that has a huge plot hole in it. I won't get into that, but we let that slide because it's time travel, and time travel is just weird like that.
Did this come right before the resurgence of Spider-Man 2099 in the comics? Like, it kind of preceded that. There seemed to be this wave of...
It was before that.
Of things that just wanted to bring 2099 back.
Like Time Storm. Yeah, I think Time Storm. Do you know what I'm talking about? Time Storm?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that came during the Shattered Dimensions era. So... I guess it still kind of pertained at that point. It was only a year later. It wasn't a huge wait between those two games. That whole game was inside, which I think was kind of one of its negative points. It took place entirely inside of Alchemax. So, there weren't any outdoor environments, which I think kind of worked against it. It had some interesting things. Like, it actually had Black Cat 2099. And it's never really clearly defined if that was like just a clone of Felicia Hardy, or if it was like Felicia in another form or something like that. And then at the end, you want me to spoil it? I'll spoil it. At the end, it turns out that the big boss is actually an evil version of Peter Parker.
Oh.
Which is, I think, no, I'm not going to say that. Because I might be misremembering here, but that was something that Peter David really wanted to do. So we did that. We had Anti-Venom in that game because Anti-Venom was a big deal at the time.
I remember, and he was like this big hulking Anti-Venom.
Yeah, totally. And I think like that particular character model, I think is really beautiful, and even as a 360 game, I think kind of holds up today.
No kidding, it was gorgeous looking. I mean, a lot of that game was really pretty to look at. So back on the 2099 thing, do you know if there was any push from Marvel to make a 2099 game? I mean, it just seemed like he just suddenly appeared in like several different mediums at the same time, and then eventually found his own comic back. I mean,
I think what the answer to that question is that Activision thought he'd make a fun game character, like. Just his world in Shattered Dimensions was really cool.
Yeah. Like
the way it was presented, I don't want to say Blade Runner, but it had a really cool kind of futuristic look to it that, I hadn't quite seen. I don't know that I've seen like something quite like it before.
Yeah, no. And the gameplay for him was wildly different than the other ones.
Yeah, totally. A lot of falling, a lot of gliding.
Yeah. And, he doesn't web sling, right? He just kind of zips around, and he's got that Matrix-like effect.
Yeah, I will say actually that Edge of Time corrected what I think is probably the biggest fault of Shattered Dimensions in that being the characterization of 2099. In Shattered Dimensions, we kind of made him another Peter Parker. Really, he's a little jokey, where Miguel's not really like that. But yeah, I think. Again, that goes back to like what are people expecting and what do they really want? Because people don't really know Spider-Man 2099. He has a cool costume.
Yeah.
At least at that point.
Are these comic flavored games your favorite like type of game adaptation? If you were to direct a game, is this what you would choose to do?
I think so. Yeah. And I think I think the game being produced now mostly fits into that category, with the kind of caveat that it's definitively its own universe.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but it has like the Feast center in it, so like like you don't get much more comic nerdy than that.
Exactly. Yeah. We the Feast is in Lego Marvel Superheroes. I made sure that was in there.
There you go.
I think it's in the Amazing Spider-Man 2. I think. I know Horizon is. because Horizon was still around and kicking back then. But yeah, so that is that category, and there are many more examples that we didn't get into. But in the final category, I think we can finally move on, is games that exist in the universe, or at least like really try to present themselves as something that directly relates to comics. So real quickly here, one of them I think that's here is an old game called Spider-Man and the X-Men and Arcade's Revenge, which is kind of a sequel to the famous issue of Uncanny X-Men where Spider-Man joins them against Arcade, and there's like a big pinball machine, and they're all like pinballs that Arcade is playing and terrorizing them with it in the murder world facility that he has created. And this game kind of takes that approach, and they're in Murder World again, and it's different mutants this time. It's Wolverine and Storm. Storm is underwater this whole game.
Yeah.
Shooting lightning bolts.
Yeah, and Wolverine is in a giant cake land.
Yeah, I think it's like a Babes in Toyland kind of setup for him. Yeah, Cyclops is in there in his X-Force attire. I guess that's what he was wearing at the time.
And Spider-Man gets the boring opening level, which was just like him going from one building to another.
Yeah, and I think it's the video game debut of Carnage as well. This game actually came out in 92, which I think is the same year that Carnage did. So there wasn't a whole lot to go on in terms of knowing who Carnage is other than his opening story. And there's actually a point where you beat him and the Carnage suit kind of goes away from him, and it's like a naked dude. It's like a naked 2D sprite. He's just sitting there. So full male nudity on your Super Nintendo.
All right, that's what we all came for.
Yeah, so there was that game.
That game goes in line with the young Dan Gavosden was not good enough to beat this game because it was so hard.
Hard, don't be hard on yourself there. No one beat that game.
I remember there being like a point in the Storm level where I was just like, I think this is impossible. I don't think you can practically beat this part of the level. I think I famously could only beat the Wolverine one if I said a prayer, and that was it.
It does have a really cool commercial, which I covered in one of my videos.
Oh, cool.
It's only 15 seconds long, but has some really cool animation that they created, I think, just for the commercial.
Neat.
Yeah, it was. But yeah, so a much better game, jumping significantly further along in the timeline here, is Ultimate Spider-Man, which I've kind of getting the feeling is a favorite of yours, Dan.
Yes, this would be the other one that's vying for like top place, and my favorite in terms of the web slinging ability throughout the game. Is this the one you were thinking about when I made that reference?
I was actually thinking of Web of Shadows.
Okay.
To me, the web slinging in Ultimate Spider-Man was kind of a step back because it was very much simplified from Spider-Man 2. And that was a thing that made me not really love it when it came out. But in retrospect, as just a Spider-Man fan, this definitely there could be an argument that this is the best Spider-Man game. I think that's a fair argument. I
love the art style of it, the wide variety of gameplay situations, and I really like the web slinging. I can see where like it is less sophisticated, but there was something about the simplicity of how momentum worked in the game, and that the webs were actual tangible items for once. Like if a web hit a building, it would bend around the building, and you could sling a web into like an overpass, and it would flick you up into the air. And I remember spending probably hundreds of hours on all of the additional bonus challenges where you just like spin your webs through these hoops, and it drove me insane. But I got so good at the web slinging in that game. Yeah, it was like a new muscle I found on my body, so it may be more like that it's not the best at web slinging. I just obsessed over it the most.
Yeah. Well, one thing that was really cool at the time, they were making a big deal out of the fact that this was canon. This was Ultimate Spider-Man canon. Turns out it wasn't.
I mean, they even like advertised a Venom storyline during the Imminent run as being, it would address this game and it would show you how it fit into canon and all this stuff, and that didn't really work out either.
Yeah, that was what, in the 130s-ish, somewhere around there?
Yeah. And it's like it's a typical one of those, like, Bendis doesn't play games with marketing. Like, marketing has one idea and Bendis has a whole other different idea.
Well, I mean, I think this was Activision marketing and not so much Marvel at the time. And, that was years apart too. It was like it was like 5 years between this game coming out and that happening in the comics. So at the time when you played this, it did fit.
Absolutely.
And the presentation is top notch. It still holds up. It's beautiful. The kind of cartoonish, Bagley come to life kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you could be Venom in it, and you could eat people.
With that awesome Grand Theft Auto mode where eventually S.H.I.E.L.D. shows up and tries to take you down, which at a certain point gets to be impossible, but it was fun while it lasted.
Yeah, for some reason I remember the beetle chase in this being like stupidly hard.
Oh yeah, that was difficult.
Yeah, that was like the rest of the game I was fine with, but just like that one damn chase took me forever.
Yeah, and there's a great Electro chase and a Rhino chase where you have to spin your web through buildings that he's run through. I remember thinking that was really visually exciting, and you're like saving people from cars that are stuck into the side of buildings.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I need to go back to that one. I haven't really played it since it was new. I've watched it a few times on just cool highlights on YouTube and stuff. And,
yeah,
it holds up, and it's an all-time great for sure.
Story-wise, the big thing I think that didn't match up when we're talking about these kind of in-universe games is that like this one, the big twist at the end is that like it kind of confirmed that the reason Peter's parents died was because they were like killed because of the Venom symbiote that they had created, that their plane was shot down by someone, and that you would find out in the comic who that was. And then ultimately in the comic, in the Ultimate Origins series, it was revealed that the Hulk killed Peter's parents.
Oh, right. I forgot about that.
And which was really bizarre because Peter, Bendis had already set up this whole like intrigue that like they were on a plane that was like seemingly shot down in relation to the other interested company that wanted the Venom symbiote, and then Bendis seemed to forget that he had set that up and went with the Hulk instead. A far
he just
less,
changed his mind.
Yeah, that too, but a far less interesting thing, I think. Yeah,
that they're not incredibly beholden if they make a comic. It is a different audience, There's crossover for sure, but it's a different audience.
Well, I mean,
not everyone who faithfully read Ultimate Spider-Man comics played this game, and definitely not everyone who played this game read Ultimate Spider-Man comics. I
choose to believe that the video game story is the true one because I like it better.
I do too. There's a part where Peter becomes Carnage, or it's revealed that Peter is Carnage or something.
Oh yeah, that he has the Carnage symbiote like inside him in some way.
That was the part that stood out to me. I remember
I totally forgot about that.
Yeah, I went back and way back when I was working on Shattered Dimensions, I just did the YouTube thing for this game just to remind myself what had happened here and try to make things line up as best I could, and there was stuff like that.
How wild. I forgot all about that.
Yeah, there's all kinds of like really cool kind of twists and turns, and Ultimate being its own universe, you could do that kind of stuff. Really cool Wolverine Venom fight at the beginning of the game, as I recall.
In the bar. Yeah. I'm having a real, I'm just being overcome with a wave of nostalgia right now thinking about this. I haven't really, put much thought into it. But, yeah, that was a great game. I mean, even if it's just seeing Bagley's art come to life, that I'll pay $50 just to see that.
Yeah, there's actually another good kind of Bagley game I didn't really go over because it didn't come out in the United States. There's a Japanese Famicom game called Spider-Man Lethal Foes, which is not really based on the Lethal Foes comics at all. It's just it's really just a hodgepodge of villain fights. But it's probably the best looking kind of 16-bit game. I don't know if I'd call it the best. Some would call it the best 16-bit game. I still prefer Maximum Carnage, but But it's kind of weird that it didn't come out here. It has the Harry Osborn Green Goblin in it, which is interesting.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and then of course it ends with Venom and Carnage, like everything in the 90s had to.
I love that video you did, just to give you a shout out on your thing, where it was like counting up the villain appearances,
right?
And how like every game is like Venom and Carnage.
Yep, pretty much. Yeah, just real quickly, the other kind of oddity of Spider-Man games out there is that I only recently found out about myself was there was a trilogy of adventure games from the early 90s that only came out in Italy, as far as I can tell.
Wow.
Yeah, they're all like 15 minutes long. They're super short. But it was like a Hobgoblin one, a Doctor Doom one, and a Carnage one. And they're like point-and-click adventure games, like an old LucasArts or a Sierra game or something.
What
like
does
that.
a 15-minute adventure game even look like?
Well, that's if you know what you're doing, so I'm sure it's an hour or two.
Okay, all right. All right, so the classic adventure game style.
Yeah. So yeah, also fitting into the kind of existing in universe would be the Amazing Spider-Man games, both of them. The second one was, you could almost put in the adaptation camp, but I think the main story was more about Carnage than it was about Electro and that version of the Green Goblin, which I'm not a huge fan of. Yeah, but the first Amazing Spider-Man game is actually, while it's not one of the greatest Spider-Man games, it is. I think it's still a good game, and
it got good reviews when it came out.
Decent ones. Solid. It's solid. And in terms of just my personal involvement with it, it's one of my favorite kind of universe building games because we put a lot of thought into the Amazing Spider-Man movie universe and how this fits in it while also kind of honoring the comics. And like my personal favorite thing that I contributed was the backstory to the Rhino character that we have, which is basically Rocksteady from Turtles, more or less, if you get that down to it, because it's not a guy in a suit. It's actually a crossbreed between man and Rhino.
And that was one of the first big things that they revealed about the game.
Yeah. And we had a Scorpion like that too, and what were some of the other ones? They were mostly along the kind of animalistic theme. Vermin, Iguana. The only game appearance of Iguana.
There you go. And he was.
I didn't know there was an Iguana until Beanock said, "Hey, we want to make Iguana for this game." We realized it was a pretty good fit.
I remember it was heavily advertised on the back of Iguana, and I was like, "How many people think this is the lizard, but don't really know the difference?"
Yeah, I know. Like there were people in our office who were like, your lizard might look better than the actual. Your Iguana might look more like the lizard than the lizard does. Not at any official level. I don't want to get like weird rumors out there, but just in fun talk. I was like, he looks really good. they made really. I love the Scorpion. I think Scorpion looks badass. But yeah, so I think the backstory for Rhino that we have in that Amazing Spider-Man 1 game is better than the Rhino that would actually appear in Amazing Spider-Man 2. And
I'm not going to fight you on that.
I had an idea, and I'm not going to get into it here, but I do have an idea of how those could still work. But anyway, going back to the point of this whole bucket that I've put this into, the Amazing Spider-Man movie game was basically a sequel, like a 1.5 of the Amazing Spider-Man, and it was all about Alistair Smythe and the Spider Slayers, and it kind of presented Smythe as an Oscorp scientist who was trying to, do good and rid the world of the lizard happening again, and goes crazy, goes too far. It's got some pretty cool story beats in there.
It looked like it got really like big in parts too, in a way Spider-Man games never had been. You had big city-wide set pieces.
Right, yeah.
In a way that we'd never seen before.
Humongous. Yeah, like there was one, I think almost at the beginning of the game, I want to say, very close to it, where it's like the size of an entire New York park. Like that was like how big this particular Spider Slayer was, which isn't practical at all. There's no way that could really happen. But
where did he build this in secret?
Yeah, exactly. And not tell anybody. It was fun because we had like Morbius as just a backstage, and you only know he's in there if you read the bios, kind of thing. And I was trying to kind of build a world that we could, maybe think forward to in future games, which is something I'll talk to a bit more in a minute. Then, Amazing Spider-Man 2 was that had some difficulties in the production processes I'll really get into, but it kind of turned into it did have like the boss fights from the movie, but it was more about Carnage and the version of Carnage we had also kind of closed a story that never really closed in the Amazing movies, which was finding Peter or Uncle Ben's killer. I don't know if you remember that he had like a star on his wrist or something, and that story was never really brought to a conclusion. But we did that in the game, and it kind of played into the beginning of Cletus Cassidy and how he became Carnage with no Venom in this universe, which was weird. But they made a pretty cool Carnage at the end of the game that you could fight.
Well, at least somebody closed up that plot hole.
More time. There's a pretty cool Craven kind of subplot in there too, where he's kind of mentoring Peter there for a while, and then he has like his own nefarious kind of own intentions in doing this. The Amazing Spider-Man 1 is a much better game than 2 was, but there's some stuff in 2 that I like.
It was ambitious. It was ambitious on its own right, which I appreciated from it.
Yeah, it got back to the web sticking to buildings, which was one of the hangups people had about 1, because it got away from that. You could sling into the sky.
Was 2 the one with the kind of like pre-programmed free run mode where you could point it in a direction and watch the play out?
Oh, watch it? I don't know about watch it, but they both had a web rush mode, it was called.
Yeah, that's it.
Kind of pause the game and pick a specific spot, and you would like zip to it really quickly. It was a good, fast way to traverse through the city. Those are most of the games I wanted to cover here. There's still a lot more. But what I wanted to do, going back to what I started talking about almost 2 hours ago at this point.
We're bad at keeping this short, for sure.
That's fine. I could talk about Spider-Man games all day. But in terms of Spider-Man PS4, what I see and what I'm hoping for is a really well-defined new Spider-Man universe. It's the kind of thing I was kind of angling at, like when I was working on Amazing Spider-Man 2 and making those Amazing Spider-Man 1 more so, and those in-depth bios and stuff like that, just the kind of world building of it all. You're gonna, I really hope that they're thinking ahead. They're not just thinking about this game. They're thinking about the stuff that happens in this game and how that could, factor into what happens in maybe like a trilogy of games. I have no idea. Maybe this is the only game they'll make. I have no idea. But it's my personal hope, and I kind of get the feeling that they're thinking in those terms. What we know at this point is that Spider-Man has been doing his thing for 8 years. He's 23 years old. We know Miles Morales is in it. We don't know what that means exactly. But that's a pretty cool, kind of new wrinkle, because it's obviously not going to be the same treatment that Miles gets in Ultimate Comics, because Peter was dead when he came about. So they're going to have a relationship. Does that mean that Miles becomes Spider-Man in this game? I don't think it will. I think it might happen in the second or third game in some way, but it might. I don't know. And you're getting Mr. Negative is the main villain so far. We know that he probably isn't the main villain of the entire game, but he's the one that they're really talking about right now, which is cool because we've never really seen him in a game. There's a cool thing going on with his relationship with Mary Jane. Maybe, they're kind of being dodgy about what their actual relationship is. It kind of comes off like they're friends. Maybe they've dated, maybe they haven't. Maybe this game is leading toward them dating. I think that would be really interesting. Apparently one of the first things that happens in this game is the Kingpin. You defeat him early on in the game, and that's apparently been possibly the main nemesis of Spider-Man so far in this universe. And, who do we have as running for mayor? Actually, it says re-elect this person, and that's Norman Osborn. So I'm actually personally hoping that Norman has never been Green Goblin. And that we get like a nice, real backstory where we maybe kind of grow to like him, and maybe he meets Peter and they become, friendly, kind of like I guess they kind of were in the first movie. But even more so than that, I think you can do that in the length of a big open world. Who knows how long this game's going to be? I think they're probably going to go for a 20 to 30 hour game would be my guess. I don't know. I'm
so hoping that this game seems to be borrowing heavily from Arkham Asylum, which, like, weirdly enough, I thought every game was going to steal from Arkham Asylum, and in many ways it still remains one of the only games of its type to do what it's done as well as it's done what it did, which is
in terms of like universe building
gameplay, making every element of the superheroes like arsenal and world kind of fit together like completely cohesively. Like there's not a moment in that where you're like, oh well, Batman, like there's a reason why he can't use this thing here. No, he's got all of his gadgets and they all work exactly the way you'd think they'd work, and the world just plays out exactly like you are Batman. You don't have to really suspend belief very much in those games, other than why is the city so empty? Like everybody just stayed in because it's Christmas or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
But what I want to see the most from this game, and you're talking about it a little bit, is that, first of all, we get that incredible, gameplay where I feel like I have all of Spider-Man's arsenal without any caveat to it. But also that, and this is rare in Spider-Man comics, is that you get this cohesiveness of the world. Like, I feel like the Arkham games, all the villains have their own little, like, layers, but they all feel of a piece to that city. Like, they all belong there, and they all, like, clearly work and communicate with each other. And Spider-Man's comics are always kind of like, maybe in the rare instances of the Sinister Six, as we talked about earlier, they feel like, okay, like Dr. Octopus is over here, and the Shocker is over here in another place, and they don't ever really merge, and you never get that strong a sense of Spider-Man's New York, even though New York is very present in Spider-Man comics. And to me, this game is a real opportunity to present like a 0 year like kind of story from Scott Snyder or these Arkham games, where it's like, oh, Spider-Man's universe can feel cohesive and all tied together, and that has me, at least narratively, the most excited.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing you can only really get with 50 years of history behind you. Yeah, is to know how these kind of relationships all play out, and at the same time, they may play with them and do things we don't expect. I'm sure there's going to be a lot that's in line with what we know. There's one question I have. It's like, is Gwen Stacy in this universe at all? Like, one thing that I talk about in one of my videos is that if you look at Peter's wall, he's got pictures, and there's a picture of the George Washington Bridge and a picture of the what's the other bridge?
The Brooklyn Bridge.
The Brooklyn Bridge. Yeah. There's pictures of both of those, and of course, as hardcore Spider-Man fans know, it's actually the Brooklyn Bridge pictured that Gwen Stacy dies at, but it's identified as the George Washington Bridge. So, like, is that like indicating that Gwen Stacy died at one of those places, or is it just like coincidence, or is it a deliberate Easter egg for geeks like me to discover and put in YouTube videos? I don't know.
I don't think anything's an accident in these videos. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've messed up a couple times. I'll say that. But yeah. So I think my ultimate point here is that all the signs are there that they're really putting a lot of thought into a cohesive, huge Spider-Man universe with, new origins that kind of stick to the same basic idea, which is what Ultimate did. It kind of reminds me of a new Ultimate universe. And, I hope that is actually what they're thinking. Like they know, they kind of know what they're going to do in the next one already. Maybe they don't have all the plot details pointed out, but they know that certain characters are going to keep going through, a through line that they've already kind of sort of made, created, and they're setting things up. Yet at the same time, this will feel like a complete singular story with a satisfying conclusion. And, be, at least at this point, the best Spider-Man game ever made. That's my hope.
That's a modest ask. Yeah. I also want Peter Parker to be a big part of the game. In the Arkham games, you get to play as Bruce Wayne for like 5 minutes in each game, and it's typically for like walking moments. Where you're the opening of the game, and he walks to find the bat suit, and you get that dramatic reveal. But to me, Peter Parker is so much more a part of the Spider-Man story, and it's never really been handled that fully in any of these games. I guess like Ultimate is the one where you get closest to playing outside of costume.
We had some in Amazing Spider-Man 2. There were some Peter moments, but it wasn't a lot. It was like Peter was going to visit Kraven. The way Kraven was portrayed at this time was like almost like in the Ultimate comics, where he's kind of like a star hunter. He was a reality star, I think, in the Ultimate comics, and this he's just like the most famous hunter in the world or something. And he went in there under the guise of being a Daily Bugle reporter, which he wasn't, but he pretended to be. So we got that element in there.
I just would love to have like Peter have to go on like a photography session, whatever, and then as a player you have to find a way to duck out, like stealthily with no one seeing you. Like that would be really cool.
I mean, I'd like to see stuff like you're on a date with MJ, and something terrible is happening that Spider-Man needs to tend to. You choose. Do you stay here and have a great day with MJ, or do you go save the day and sacrifice your relationship?
Yeah.
I think that's the kind of thing you can do in a video game that you can't do in a comic or a movie or anything like that. And that's why I think there's so much untapped potential for Spider-Man games.
Or do you covertly shoot your web up at the ceiling, pull down a fog vent or whatever, and flood the room with smoke, and then beat people up in the smoke, and then return to dinner?
There you go.
There you go.
There's one mission for you right there.
Well, I can't wait, and we'll have to have you back on when that game comes out to do a really thorough conversation about it.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be a lot to say.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on. This has been far too delayed, and this was fun talking Spider-Man video games with you.
Absolutely. I'm always up for it, and it was a lot of fun indeed.
Well, before you go, Chris, I was curious if you could tell the listeners at home where they might find you on the internet.
Absolutely. I think if you just want to go to one place to find all the applicable links to me, you can go to my Twitter at cbake76. That's CBAKE76. The YouTube channel's there, and if you want to go there, it's youtube.com/cbake76. And, you can get the link to my book there if you want to. And I would love it if you read that. It's only $3. It's $2.99, which is less than most comics these days. Yeah, so just check those things out if you're interested.
And I love them. I can't recommend your videos enough. So you have my full-throated recommendation.
Thank you very much, sir.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Hey, it's Chris again, back with one extra message. When Dan and I recorded this segment, I wasn't sure I actually wanted to do what I'm going to tell you about, but I am doing it, and it's pretty big for Spider-Man game fans. It's called Spider Madness. It's going along with the March Madness basketball tournament about to start up. And through the magic of Twitter polls on my personal Twitter, at cbake76, we're going to do a huge tournament where every Spider-Man game ever created, from huge blockbusters to cell phone games to edutainment, is going to go up against each other to determine the greatest Spider-Man game of all time. As I record this, I'm producing a video that will go further into explaining what this is all about. But just keep tabs on my YouTube, my Twitter account, or the hashtag Spider Madness, all one word, no hyphen. Sorry, guys. And you'll learn a lot more about it. I'll also talk about it on the Amazing Spider Slack. Voting starts Thursday, March 15th. Thanks, everybody.
Well, you made it to the end of the episode. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Chris Baker, and that you are as excited for the Spider-Man game on the PS4 as he and I are. And please, don't forget to join our Amazing Spider Slack. Subscribe to our new podcast, The Untold Talks of Spider-Man, available where all fine podcasts are downloaded, and join Chris for his Spider Madness when it kicks off in the coming weeks. Mark and I will be back shortly with our episode all about Peter's supporting cast in the Romita run, but until then, why not consider joining our Patreon club? Remember, for just $3.99 a month, the price of a new comic, you'll gain access to our exclusive new issue reviews, Swarm B-Book reviews, extended interviews, mailbags, and more. And for $10 or more a month, you'll get access to some awesome commissioned artwork. We just got the Ron Friends artwork in this week, and man, it's stunning. So just click on the link in our podcast notes and join us on Patreon. This week on Patreon, Mark and I will be reviewing Amazing Spider-Man number 797, the dynamite start of the Go Down swinging arc. And we'll be talking about the newly announced creative team that's taking over Amazing Spider-Man in issue 802. But until then, you can always follow me on Twitter at SupSpiderTalk, and be sure to remember that with great podcasts must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.